We've been covering some outstanding soldiers here at Biographics lately. Today's protagonist is no exception and will probably rank among the very top because of his determination, courage, tactical competence, and resilience. This is the extraordinary story of Master Sergeant Raul Roy Benavidez, the Lazarus soldier, and of his 3 lives. This outstanding individual never surrendered in the face of adversity from childhood to military life. Those who know his story mostly remember him for a 6-hour cavalry during which, to great personal sacrifice, he held at bay an entire battalion of North Vietnamese infantry to save 8 wounded comrades. But how did he get there? And what happened afterwards? Well, let's begin with his difficult childhood in Texas. Raul Perez Benavidez, also known as Roy, was born in Cuero, Texas on the 5th of August 1935. Roy was born in a family of Mexican Americans established in DeWitt County, Texas. Roy's father, Salvador, worked as a sharecropper. He was married to Teresa Perez, an American Yaqui Indian. The childhood of Roy, it was not a happy one. On the 7th of November 1938, Salvador died of tuberculosis, aged only 27. Roy was only 3. 4 years later, Teresa also died again from tuberculosis. Roy and his younger brother, Roger, they were sent to live with their uncle Nicholas, aunt Alejandra, and 8 cousins at El Campo, Texas. Roy dropped out of school in the 7th grade. His help was needed to support the family, so he had to forego an education to work in the fields, picking sugar beets and cotton. Texas in the early 50s did not offer many prospects to a farm laborer who was also a school dropout. Roy found a chance for a career and a better future in the military. In 1952, at the age of 17, Roy enlisted in the Texas National Guard. 2 years later, Roy joined the U.S. Army as Private Benavidez, receiving his infantry training at Fort Ord, California. Benavidez's service duties soon took him out of the country, first to South Korea, then to Germany. Upon his return to the States in 1959, he reunited with Hilaria Coya, childhood sweetheart, and the two married on the 7th of June. They went on to have 3 children, Noel, Yvette, and Denise. By now, Army life for Benavidez was not only a means to provide for his family, it was the life, pure and simple, a life that he enjoyed and he was very good at. He expanded his training, and in 1959 he attended the military police school in Fort Gordon, Georgia. Benavidez racked up qualifications, becoming also a paratrooper, and he was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. By 1965, Benavidez was on a tour of duty in Vietnam, acting as a military advisor to the South Vietnamese Army. One day, he was on a solo patrol mission, which, according to some accounts, was part of a covert operation. Its aim was to gather intelligence of possible Viet Cong infiltration within the South Vietnamese Army. That was a fateful day. Benavidez stepped on a landmine, and it left him badly wounded with serious bone and cartilage damage to his spine. He was immediately evacuated to Brooke Hospital in San Antonio, then to Fort Sam, Houston. The Army doctors gave him a devastating diagnosis. He would never walk again, meaning they had to discharge him from the military. They might as well have thrown him on top of another mine. To him and his family, active service meant making a living. It meant life itself. A discharge, it was the equivalent of death. What Roy Benavidez did in the following weeks would have been described as a miracle in another place and time. Ignoring medical advice, Benavidez went on a recovery program of his own. In secret every night, he slipped from his bed and onto the floor. Using his elbows and chin, he dragged his body to the nearest wall. Then, in a pain so excruciating that it left him in tears, Roy would set himself up against the wall and propped himself into a standing position. He then spent the night just trying to wheel his toes. Right foot, left foot, and then again. Every single night, he was determined to walk and return to Vietnam. He felt a sense of duty towards his fellow comrades, many of whom came back from their tours of duty with limbs missing, truly unable to walk again. Night after night, Benavidez continued with his ritual. Sometimes he was caught by the nurses, given some sleeping pills, and put back to bed. But most nights he managed to keep his appointment with the wall, and he recovered most of his mobility. After 9 months, a doctor showed up with discharge papers. Benavidez told him to hold on and watch what he was able to do. Roy jumped out of the bed, stood in front of the doctor, almost fainting because of his back pain. The doctor was impressed and told him, "Benavidez, if you walk out of this room, I will tear the papers." And Benavidez, he walked out of the room. He walked out of the hospital. Like St. Lazarus, he had walked out of his grave and into the start of his second life. After leaving the hospital, Roy Benavidez spent months in grueling rehabilitation and training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This is the main training center for the U.S. Army Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets. He entered Fort Bragg with a limp. Soon he was running 5 to 10 miles and dropping 1,500 push-ups every single day while perfecting his parachuting skills. In January of 1968, Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez was back in Vietnam. He had been assigned to Detachment B-56, 5th Special Forces Airborne Group, with the codename Tango Mike Mike. In NATO radio code, these simply indicate the letters TMM. Apparently, Benavidez himself had selected these letters, an acronym that stood for That Mean Mexican. It would only take a couple of months before the Mean Mexican launched into the military action that would eventually earn him the Medal of Honor. He would later describe what happened as 6 hours in hell. On the 2nd of May 1968, Benavidez was at the Loc Ninh Green Beret outpost near the Cambodian border attending Mass. At 1:30 p.m., the radio came alive with a panicked request for help. It came from a squad of 12 men, a reconnaissance team that had been dropped by helicopter west of Loc Ninh, and they were tasked with collecting intelligence on enemy activity. The team included 9 Vietnamese Montagnard, or mountain men. These are an ethnic group which had sided with the US and South Vietnam against the Communist North. The team also included 3 US servicemen, Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, Staff Sergeant Lloyd Frenchy Masseau, and Specialist 4 Brian O'Connor. The patrol had stumbled upon an entire infantry battalion of the North Vietnam People's Army, the NVA, numbering up to 1,000 men. They had been quickly surrounded. 3 helicopters had already attempted to extract them, but intense enemy fire prevented them from landing. Benavidez was listening with increased concern to the radio. He knew the men involved, and Sergeant Leroy Wright was a good friend. Back in April, Benavidez and another comrade were on an intelligence mission deep behind enemy lines when the other soldier had been wounded. A helicopter had come to extract them. Unable to land, the chopper had lowered 2 ropes for the men to hook onto. During the flight, the 2 ropes were badly tangled and were about to break. Sergeant Wright, who had been on the helicopter, had lowered himself with another rope, disentangled the knot, and then saved Benavidez's life. Tango Mike Mike took a snap decision. He would help Leroy and the others. They would make it back alive. As a 4th rescue helicopter was being readied for another attempt, Benavidez jumped on board, armed with only a knife and his medical kit. The chopper reached the site of the engagement. The reconnaissance team was surrounded by the NVA soldiers. Enemy fire prevented an immediate landing, so the aircraft had to move 75 yards away from Leroy Wright and his men. Benavidez jumped to the ground and ran towards the men when a Vietnamese bullet hit him in his right leg. He fell, but was immediately up again and running. Next, it was the full blast of a grenade that slammed him to the ground, his face covered in shrapnel. But this was still not enough to stop him. He got up again and he reached the patrol that had split now into 2 groups. 4 of the Mongards lay dead, and he took one of their AK assault rifles and then focused on treating the wounded. Luckily, he had brought along plenty of morphine for those who were screaming in pain. The only way to stop the overwhelming NVA battalion was to call in an airstrike. Benavidez did so via radio, also requesting another helicopter. Another bullet at this point pierced his right thigh. Thankfully, the oncoming chopper succeeded in landing, and Benavidez dragged the dead and the wounded on board. The NVA soldiers intensified their fire against the aircraft, which prompted another act of sacrifice from Benavidez. Rather than jumping aboard, he ordered the pilot to fly to the 2nd group while he provided suppressive fire from the ground. Benavidez spotted Leroy Wright. He was on the ground, not far from the 2nd group, but he was dead. Instinctively, Benavidez removed from Wright's body all documents containing their unit's radio codes and call signs. These codes would have made useful intelligence in the hands of the NVA. It was at this point that everything went wrong. Even more wrong. First, a bullet hit him in the stomach, the 3rd shot he had endured. Then, a grenade exploded behind his back, with more shrapnel piercing his flesh. Worse still, the pilot was shot dead, and the helicopter crashed. Benavidez limped back to the wreckage and was able to extract his wounded comrades. Their only path to safety was to call in another airstrike and get another chopper. But first, he quickly set up a defense perimeter, all the while encouraging, directing, and caring for the wounded men. Throughout the fighting, Benavidez, a devout Catholic, made the sign of the cross so many times that his arms were going like an airplane propeller. Jets and helicopter gunships finally returned to harass the enemy. By this time, Benavidez was almost rendered blind from all of the blood in his eyes, so he had to rely on his sense of hearing to direct the airstrikes. The new rescue chopper, it finally landed. Benavidez carried his comrades to the safety of the helicopter, one at a time. During the 2nd trip, while he was shoving Frenchy Bisseau on board, an NVA soldier closed up to him and clubbed him on the jaw with the butt of his rifle. Benavidez fell, then got up just in time to stop the soldier's bayonet with his bare right hand. The Vietnamese man managed to slash his left forearm before Benavidez fought back with his Bowie knife, stabbing him multiple times. After having secured Frenchie on board, Benavidez spotted 2 more NVA troops advancing, shooting the chopper. He grabbed an AK-47 and fired at them, silencing them for good. His mission was not finished though. With the little remaining strength in his body, Benavidez rushed back to the defense perimeter to rescue the last Montagnard and all the classified documents. Benavidez, at this point, was in critical condition. He was bleeding from numerous wounds and he was blinded by the blood hemorrhaging in his eyes. He also had a dislocated jaw, his intestines were exposed because of the gunshot in his abdomen, and he was having to hold them in with his hands. But everybody else was safe, so he allowed himself to be pulled into the chopper. En route to Loch Lin, Benavidez closed his eyes. When the chopper landed at the field hospital, the medics tended to the wounded immediately and collected the bodies of the dead soldiers. One at a time, they were placed in body bags. Amongst them was Staff Sergeant Raul Roy Benavidez, codename Tango Mike Mike. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light. Jerry Cottingham, a friend, recognized Roy's body and screamed, "That's Benavidez! Get a doc!" When the doctor arrived, he placed a hand on Roy's chest to check for a heartbeat. He shook his head, saying, "There's nothing I can do for him." The doctor proceeded to zip up the body bag. Half of Sergeant Benavidez's body had already been swallowed by the sinister black bag. Then the doctor, closing the zipper, had the surprise of his life. The body of Benavidez spat at him. The surprised doctor reversed Roy's condition from dead to "he won't make it, but will try." Roy had not surrendered. He was in critical condition, having suffered more than 30 wounds. He could not talk because of the broken jaw, and his eyes had been sealed shut by congealed blood. But Benavidez was still alive. Unable to communicate otherwise, he spat to attract the doctor's attention, and it had worked. Staff Sergeant Benavidez had saved the lives of 8 men to great personal sacrifice. He spent almost a year in hospitals to recover from his injuries. He had 7 major gunshot wounds, one of them having barely missed his heart. Both arms had been slashed by a bayonet. Benavidez had shrapnel in his head, scalp, shoulder, buttocks, feet, and legs. His right lung was also destroyed, and he had injuries to his mouth and the back of his head from being clubbed with a rifle butt. The Medal of Honor citation would later acknowledge that his fearless personal leadership, tenacious devotion to duty, and extremely valorous actions in the face of overwhelming odds were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect the utmost credit on him and the United States Army. So, how did he do it? How did Benavidez manage to accomplish these actions which are just short of miraculous? And how do other soldiers and individuals in high-risk situations accomplish feats that are pure superhuman? Benavidez later claimed that he was simply doing his duty, and to survive 6 hours in hell, he clearly had a strong sense of that. He was motivated to protect his friends and to save the classified documents. Losing the intelligence may have endangered further lives. In addition to a strong sense of purpose, Roy Benavidez was no fresh recruit. He was an experienced sergeant of the Green Berets, the special forces of the US Army. In the 1960s, their typical training included parachuting, marksmanship, close-quarter combat, and extensive medical first aid drills, which made virtually every Green Beret a trained paramedic. This was a skill Benavidez he put to good use. And yet, what is really astounding is how he managed to simply stay standing up after 6 hours of exhausting, non-stop action and a total of 36 wounds, which must have caused excruciating pain. He did administer morphine to his comrades, but never to himself, otherwise he would not have had the lucidity necessary to plan on the spot the defense perimeter, to retrieve the intel, to fight back against the NVA soldiers. The answer, though, it might lie in another drug, one created by the human body: adrenaline. The word adrenaline today is used almost as an abstract term to indicate an extremely excitable and alert state of being. In practical terms, adrenaline is a hormone and a neurotransmitter produced in the adrenal glands. Adrenaline is released into the bloodstream and conveys nerve impulses to various organs. Its effects are to prepare the body for the fight or flight response in times of extreme stress. It sets the body up for vigorous and sudden action. The key effects of the onset of adrenaline include increased heart rate and blood pressure, expansion of the air passages, and redistribution of blood to the muscles. This explains the increased strength, speed, stamina, and pain threshold experienced by individuals who, like Benavidez, find themselves in a life-and-death scenario. The effects are not limited just to the body, though. This hormone also maximizes blood glucose levels, increasing its concentrations, primarily in the brain. This is like providing a sudden boost of fuel to one's cognitive function, which enabled Benavidez to sustain 6 hours of intense fighting, but most of all, 6 hours of brilliant tactical leadership and medical and evacuation work. And what was the reward for all of these actions? Well, that would be the Medal of Honor. Staff Sergeant Benavidez was absolutely worthy of receiving the highest U.S. Army accolade, the Congressional Medal of Honor. But this did not happen immediately. As he was recovering from his wounds in 1968, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, also prestigious, but not as much as the medal. But the process to obtain the cross, it was shorter, and his commanding officer was not sure if Benavidez would survive. When Roy Benavidez, after 1 year in hospital, returned to active service, his new commander, Colonel Ralph Drake, undertook a campaign to ensure that he received the Medal of Honor. But there were two problems at this stage. First, there wasn't any witness from the US military that could confirm the full extent of his actions. Second, according to Benavidez's children, the process took so long because the action had taken place in Cambodian territory. The government could not admit to taking part in such engagements in a country that was not involved in the Vietnam War, at least officially. Finally, in 1980, a witness emerged. It was Brian O'Connor, the specialist who had survived the battle. He had been living in Fiji, but during a trip to Australia, he heard about the Benavidez case. O'Connor gladly volunteered to write a full report on Roy's actions and then flew to Washington to present it to the government. At last, on February 24th, 1981, President Reagan presented the Medal of Honor to Roy Benavidez. He was the last of the Vietnam-era military to be presented with a medal from that war. During the past decade, Benavidez had rose to the rank of Master Sergeant and had sought to advance his education, attaining his GED and a college degree. During all this time, he suffered chronic pain from his injuries. In 1976, Roy Benavidez decided it was time to retire from the army and was granted some well-deserved disability payments on top of his pension. When President Reagan had presented Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor, he had asked the former sergeant to speak to young people about the importance of pursuing education. Roy did just that. As a retired sergeant, he spent time visiting schools to stress the need for the education that he never had as a child. He also became a prolific motivational speaker, delivering talks about his extraordinary life experiences to audiences of students, military personnel, and businesses. But his days of fighting, they weren't quite done. Shortly before Memorial Day 1983, Roy Benavidez released statements to warn that the Social Security Administration planned to cut off disability payments to him and other Vietnam War veterans. A federal cost-cutting plan had terminated the disability assistance for 350,000 people over the preceding 2 years, and it was now also impacting Benavidez. The retired sergeant had developed a friendship with Ronald Reagan after being decorated, and he was not about to shy away from leveraging this friendship. He said, "I don't like to use my Medal of Honor for political purposes or personal gain, but if they can do this to me, what will they do to all the others?" 10 days after Roy's statements to the press, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret M. Hackler, said the disability reviews would become more humane and compassionate. Benavidez continued his campaign. He testified to the House Select Committee on Aging that the same administration that had given him a medal was now withdrawing his benefits, which were part of his rights as a wounded veteran. He then proceeded to file an appeal to an administrative law court. In 1983, the court overturned the initial decision and sanctioned that Benavidez continued receiving payments. It was an important precedent that would help many more veterans. From then on, Benavidez continued his engagements as a speaker in support of education and overcoming impossible odds. By all accounts, he was a loving father and grandfather. He did enforce quite a rigorous discipline at home based on his Catholic faith, and he must have appeared intimidating to his daughter's boyfriends, but as his daughter described him, he was the biggest teddy bear in life. In October of 1998, after many years of struggles against diabetes, Benavidez had his right leg amputated due to complications from the disease. He never recovered fully, and on the 29th of November, age 63, Roy Benavidez succumbed to respiratory failure at an Army hospital in San Antonio, Texas. Over the years, fellow Texans paid tribute to Benavidez. Several schools, a National Guard armory, Army Reserve Center, and even a ship of the Navy have been named after him. Roy Benavidez's life was one of struggle, sacrifice, and rebirth. Not once, but twice. And yet, he did not regard himself as someone special. The real heroes are the ones who gave their lives for their country. I don't like to be called a hero. I just did what I was trained to do. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos 4 times a week. Also hit that notification bell, just the way YouTube works. If you really want to get like a notification about when we put out a new video, you need to do that. And as always, I'll see you next time.